A couple of questions lately about which units a newer player should be investing in during the early stages of their account in FGO. So I'm going to go through all of the major classes and talk about which units are strong investments for newer players. I will throw a caveat here that I'm not going to mention any of the units that I mentioned in my farming video. I have a video about how to set up a early game free-to-play farming team using only low rarity servants and low rarity craft essences, and I mentioned in that video that you should invest in those couple of units highly and immediately. So I'm not going to bother bringing them up because I've already done a video on those couple of people. So with that said, I'm just going to go through the classes one by one and talk about who I think are the strongest, safest investments for a newer player. That's the button I'm looking for. Okay, so starting with Sabers. And unfortunately on this one, I have to give you a little bit of a tie right away. Basically, there are 3 early game Sabers. As you can see, there are only a total of 4 3-star Sabers to begin with. Bedivere does not become available until after you clear Camelot, which is chapter 6 in the main story. And by the time that you clear Camelot, you won't need to be watching videos by me anymore. So, basically, the 3 early game Sabers are Gilles, Caesar, and Fergus. Gilles is not worth investing in for newer players. He can be a fun unit, and he does have his very strange, very bizarre use. If you want to really invest in him highly, you can get a little bit of a performance out of him. But for the most part, Fergus and Caesar are the 2 options, and like I said, I kind of have to just throw out my hands between these 2 because they do such radically different things that it feels sort of useless comparing them. So Fergus, to go into it a little bit, Fergus has his attack buff, he has a defense buff, and he has an evade. Very simple, straightforward kit, but it's pretty solid, right? Gives him good survivability, increases his damage for 3 turns. When it's at level 10, that's 3 out of every 5 turns. Pretty good stuff. His Noble Phantasm is Buster type. It hits all enemies, lowers their defense, so it increases the damage that the other allies or Fergus will do to those same enemies. So pretty good stuff. And then his deck has the kind of Berserker characteristic of having 3 Buster cards, 1 Arts card, and 1 Quick card. So, yeah, pretty solid all-around unit. Like I said, decent survivability, decent damage. Little bit of team support in his decreased defense on his Noble Phantasm. But if you want a Saber who just hits things really hard, Fergus is your guy. His turn-by-turn damage is really high with the 3 Buster cards and with the attack buff. And then his MP damage is not bad, considering that it's Buster type. Caesar is a very different animal. His skills are all about team support. So, and the good thing about his skills, especially these first 2, is that they apply to the teammates as well as himself. So you get the increase MP strength, you get the increase all allies attack, and then you get to target 1 servant and increase their critical strength. So, again, pretty good stuff. Has a single target quick NP, which is the best kind of NP that there is in the game in terms of damage. The multipliers on single target quick Noble Phantasms are higher than any other type. So, actually, his NP, not only by virtue of being a single target, but also by virtue of being quick, his NP will most likely outdamage Fergus's, especially since he buffs it twice in terms of his 2 skills also apply to himself. His deck is a little bit awkward, with 2 quick cards, 1 arts card, and 2 buster cards. Makes gaining NP a little bit tricky since quick cards aren't great at that. That said, arguably not as awkward as Fergus's, because he only has 1 quick and 1 arts, versus Caesar at least has 3 cards that can generate NP. So Caesar is much more of a burst damage and team support kind of servant, compared to Fergus, who is a sustained damage and survivability kind of character. So depending on which one of those you prefer out of your units, go with one or the other. For general purpose saber use, I think they'll both serve you pretty well. Fergus is maybe a little bit more useful for farming. Caesar's maybe a little bit more useful for boss fights. You'll just kind of have to weigh that yourself. The other thing is that Artoria Lily is in the friend point summon now, I believe. I haven't ever pulled her from there. So, if that's true, I have no evidence of it. But I have been told that that's true. And if you get her, you may as well use her. I suppose her skills are extremely basic and pretty low impact. Her NP hits a little bit harder than normal because it's got a higher multiplier than most AoE Buster Noble Phantasms do. So if you happen to pull her and really want to use her, knock yourself out, go right ahead. But for most people, I would recommend choosing either Caesar or Fergus and then investing in one over the other, depending on how you like to play and what you feel like you need more. And then this whole discussion has a further caveat, which is that I would say Bedivere is better than either of them, but again, you cannot get him until after you finish Camelot, so, yeah. Anyways, if you get Bedivere, he's really great, has a single target buster NP, increases his damage, has a battery, just really strong unit. These two are fine, they will serve you perfectly well for your early game saber needs, and just invest in whichever one you prefer. Moving on to Archer. It has oft been repeated that there are no bad archers, and I would tend to agree with that statement. Basically, all of the 3-star archers have their different niches, but are quite good at them and quite strong. Billy is a crit archer. His deck is full of quick cards. He has 2 skills that buff his crit damage, so he just produces stars, gathers them up, crits, does a bunch of damage, and repeats. And if you get him snowballing, he can really do quite well, as well as his NP is single target and quick, so it's very high damage. Kid Gil, surprisingly enough, is kind of like a dedicated debuffer, in that his Noble Phantasm has its AoE, first of all, so it's all the enemies, and then it has a bunch of debuffs on it, so you can really lock down enemies if you can get that off once or especially twice in rapid succession. That can really cripple a lot of the things that enemies are going to want to do. David is a really strong support unit. He can put up a single hit evade on all allies, he can boost the damage of all allies, and he can buff his own defense. His Noble Phantasm is a little bit of a joke damage-wise, which is unfortunate. But other than that, very, very strong unit. And if you wanted to invest in him just for his support capabilities, I would not tell you that you're wrong to do so. Very good unit. The 2 most commonly cited as the best 3-star archers. Oh, and I shouldn't skip him like this, but obviously the one that I think is least interesting would be Tota. He's kind of a survival archer, so he's kind of like the 3-star archer equivalent of Cucullin. I've never found much use for him, but I have heard him been described as kind of underrated, which I would largely agree with, despite the rather pitiful state of mine. If his kit seems interesting to you, by all means, go for it. Protection from arrows is a great skill, great survivability skill. Increase buster card effectiveness and restore HP, and then increases max HP. I believe his NP... No, it doesn't. Okay. I thought that healed when it was used, but instead it's got special damage and it's AoE. Alright. So, even Tota's good, even if I don't use him very much. He still has his niche and his role, and he's quite skilled at it. The 2 most commonly cited best 3-star archers would be Uriel and Robin. A lot of people would tell you that Uriel is the better out of the 2, the reason they're compared is because they have kind of a similar niche in terms of their thing is trait damage. And trait damage is very, very strong in this game. So this is anybody who can deal extra damage based on a trait of an enemy. So, for example, you've got Skahawk, who deals extra damage to divine enemies, or Gilgamesh, who deals extra damage to servant enemies, etc. These effects are really, really strong. So if you can find somebody who has a strong anti-trait niche, they're basically always going to be a strong pick. These two have pretty wide coverage on their anti-trait bonuses. So Uriel is a anti-male servant, so she just shuts down any male enemies. She's able to charm them, which stuns them for 1 turn. And then her Noble Phantasm deals extra damage to male enemies as well. Also can charm them, I believe. Yep, high chance to apply charm status to a male, which increases with overcharge. So this is a very strong Noble Phantasm against a male, and specifically a male Saber, but even just against males generally, you'll get a lot of mileage out of this. Does a lot of damage, is able to reduce NP charge, is able to charm an enemy and stun them for a turn, preventing them from doing anything. Then she can do it again the next turn with her NP. She increases her arts card effectiveness. Very strong unit against half of all enemies in the game, which is very wide coverage, about as wide as you can expect with anti-trait damage. Now, all that said, Robin has an even better anti-trait, because he carries his characteristic in his back pocket here. His Noble Phantasm deals extra damage to poisoned enemies, and then he has a skill that poisons all enemies. At max level, this skill lasts for 5 turns and has a 5-turn cooldown, meaning he can keep this up 100% of the fight, assuming you don't change waves in between. So that means that anytime he uses his Noble Phantasm, he can pretty much reliably get the extra bonus damage from it. Or from the trait of the enemy being poisoned, unless they happen to resist it, which is unfortunate, but even still, that happens fairly rarely unless you're fighting rulers or bosses who have debuff immunity or any of that kind of thing. Most of the time you can pretty reliably stack this poison on somebody. Other than that, his Golden Rule skill is fine. This one you have to do an interlude or a rank up quest for. Pretty good skill. Gives him a hard survivability option, as well as a way to produce a couple of crit stars. If you don't know, archers have the highest natural capability to draw in crit stars out of any class in the game, so those will probably go to him. And you can combine this with his Golden Rule skill, so if you produce those stars and they go to his arts cards, and then if the Golden Rule is active and you land a crit, then he's going to charge up a massive amount of NP all at once, which lets him spam his Noble Phantasm, which again hits like a truck because the enemy is going to be debuffed and taking extra damage from the poison. So, and then, should it come to that, he's got, again, his May King skill, which lets him evade an enemy Noble Phantasm or a strong turn from an enemy and keep trucking right on through it. So I would suggest that Robin is the best 3-star archer. Most versatile in terms of, again, if Uriel's trait covers half of the enemies in the game, Robin's is going to cover 100% of enemies who can be debuffed, which is a much higher percentage than half of Uriel. So I would suggest go with Robin, but again, with the archer class, any archer that you want to go with is going to be very strong. You can't really pick wrong with the archers. Lancer is a much easier class to discuss because there is a clear winner, and that is Coup. He is a 3-star, but he's up here at the top for me. So Coup has the best defensive skill set out of any character in the game. especially as considering like a self-sufficient kind of thing. That's not the right word. Like, Mash has the best defensive skill set in the game as far as keeping your entire team alive goes. Coup has the best defensive skill set in the game as far as keeping himself alive. So, this skill is utterly ridiculous and broken, and every other time that it has been implemented, basically since this, there is the caveat that it will only last for a couple of turns. Because they did not understand game balance when they were starting this game, his does not, and it will just last forever until it gets used up. And with a shorter than average cooldown for an evade, most evades, for example, are 1 turn of evade, and then at max level will be on a 6-turn cooldown. Coup has infinite turns of evade until he gets attacked 3 times on a 5-turn cooldown. So it lasts longer and comes off cooldown quicker than your average evade most of the time. And no enemy in the game takes more than 3 actions per turn, except under very, very strange circumstances. So that's, at the very least, that's 1 full turn of invincibility if he's like soloing, or if he just happens to get attacked all 3 times in 1 turn, he at the very least has 1 full turn of evasion. But then also it will come off cooldown quicker than the average 1-turn evade. So that skill is utterly broken. Guts makes him even tankier. Once his evades run out, he can just die and then get back up. And then his last skill lets him remove all debuffs and heal himself every 5 turns. So, utterly broken unit. For some reason, they felt like they needed to upgrade his NP. Quite recently, actually. It now pierces evade and deals extra damage. It also decreases the defensive enemies that it hits. Single target quick, so it multiplier-wise is as good as anything in the game that you're going to get. So, definitely just a defensive monster. Totally immortal and unkillable, basically. And, yeah. Coup is definitely the winner for 3-star Lancers. To the point where the rest of these are barely even worth talking about. I'll do it quickly, though. If you don't have Coup and just can't get him, Proto Coup is the next best thing. He's got the same protection from arrow skill. It's just as broken, but he doesn't have the heal, the debuff cleanse, or the guts. So he's basically a much more offensive version of Coup with a lot less survivability, but still has the most important survivability skill. So he's still pretty good. Critical Strength and then Critical Start Gather Rate is a tremendous combo to have in a Servant's kit. And then Anti-Wild Beast, you fight a lot of wild beasts in the game. Demon boars and dragons and the like, so fairly wide coverage on that, and like I've talked about, anti-trait damage is really good. So if you can't get regular Coup, Proto Coup is I would say the next best option. If you can't get Proto Coup, Diarmid is like a less good version of kind of both of them. Has the standard evade, just 1 turn though. Decreases attack for female enemies, okay. Knight strategy increases his crit star drop rate. Yeah, with his 2 quick cards that each have 2 hits, he'll go from like dropping 3 stars to 4. So yeah, whoopee on that skill. Until pretty recently, he had an upgraded NP and regular Coup did not, so his NP could still outdamage him, but now that Coup has an upgraded NP, Diarmid basically serves no purpose, but he's fine for general use if you really can't get either of the Coup. Jaguar Warrior is story locked, much like Bedivere, so you can't get her until after you finish Babylon. So that's a long ways away. Don't worry about her. You've got Hector, who is a pretty decent farmer, and you've got what's his name? Romulus, who is also a pretty decent farmer, and then you've got Inshun, who is a very strange character. If you like playing really weird, you might enjoy him. Yeah, his skills are quite long, have a lot of effects. His Noble Phantasm has a ton of effects and doesn't deal any damage, and then his kit is like his deck rather is like the assassin deck, full of quick cards. Very strange playstyle for him, very unorthodox. Can be a lot of fun if that's what you're into. For me, I don't think all the investment is quite worth it compared to I can just throw Coup at something and live longer and kill things faster anyways, so yeah, go with Coup, basically, would be my answer on that one. Now, Riders, again, this one's pretty easy in that the answer is Ushi. So Ushi just has crazy damage, pretty good capability to get her own NP up as well as her allies with this skill. Increases her own damage and her allies' damage, and then has a 1 turn of aid. So decent survivability, decent damage, decent capability to get to the NP. Her NP itself is about as straightforward as it gets. Just hits one thing really, really hard. Again, single target quick, so damage multiplier on it is pretty insane. So yeah, go with Ushi. Boudica, I love her. But she does not have a very good kit. For most players, probably is not worth the investment early game. Medusa can be a decent-ish farmer. Has an NP battery skill. Has a AoE quick Noble Phantasm, so it does decent damage. Has a weird, rare 2-turn damage buff skill rather than a 1 or a 3-turn. You've got Iskandar, or Alexander, actually, this one's named, who has a skill that will buff allies crit, or not crit, but quick damage, quick cards, which is a rare enough thing that if you like to play quick, he's probably worth using just so you can get that buff. Other than that, pretty simple, couple of skills, pretty straightforward Noble Phantasm that just hits all enemies. As we've mentioned a couple times, the Rider of Resistance is story locked to the Agartha Epic of Remnant. So you're going to want to complete Agartha, then you'll get him. Do you get him, or does he just open up in the pool? I cannot remember. So basically, he doesn't exist inside the summoning pool until you finish Agartha. And I cannot remember if the game gives you a copy of him or not. So for the most part, forget about him. Go with Ushi, and that's the answer there. Come to casters. Caster's a weird class. I feel like a lot of the 3-star casters are really underpowered and not very good. Just gonna tap some servants here. Not that these taps have to mean anything. So Paracelsus can be a pretty good art support, especially for looping strategies with his recent buff. That's about all he does, though, in my estimation. Caster Coup is similar to the other Coups in that he has the protection from arrows skill, still a broken, busted, overpowered skill. Rest of his kit, I would say, is just alright. Mephistopheles and Caster Gilles and Geronimo here are basically 3 of the lowest tier servants in the game. Really unfortunate, but that's kind of how it is. So as far as 3-star casters go, I'll talk about this a little bit. The fundamental issue here is that basically all of the 3-star casters, other than maybe Paracelsus, are built to be damage dealers, but casters are inherently not good at being damage dealers. If you're unaware, every class in the game has an invisible modifier to their stats. The game does not tell you this at any point. So for casters and assassins, as 2 quick and easy examples, they get a 0.9 damage modifier to all damage that they deal. In addition to already having lower than average offensive stats, if I click on Medea here, you can see 7, 4, 18 attack. If we go back to somebody who I know doesn't have any foes, see, it's higher, right? Like, other characters are gonna have, he's got foes, are gonna have higher attack stats than Medea, than us casters generally, most of the time. So there's the lower than average stats, you've got the additional 0.9 multiplier on their damage, which further reduces the strength of their stats. Then you've got the fact that their deck will be built mostly out of arts cards, which do not deal a lot of damage. Then you've got the fact that some of the time their Noble Phantasms will be arts, which have the lowest multipliers of any Noble Phantasm type in the game. And you just have a class that inherently is not very good at dealing damage, but almost all of the low rarity casters are built to be damage units rather than support units. So, as some exceptions, you've got like Shakespeare and Hans and Mozart. And I would even throw Paracelsus into there. But these guys who will actually use their kits for the purpose of support, I would recommend building all of them depending on how you like to play. If you like to use Buster teams, go with Shakespeare. If you like to use arts teams or crit teams, you can go with Hans. If you like to use arts teams or crit teams, you can go with Mozart. And if you like to use arts teams, you can go with Paracelsus. So, however you kind of prefer to play the game, or what other types of servants you like to use most, you can use any of them as a pretty decent support option. If you really feel like you want a caster for damage purposes, because there will be assassins that you have to fight, and casters are the class with class advantage over assassins. So if you don't want to use Berserkers for those fights, and you really want to use an assassin, the two best, or not an assassin, excuse me, if you really want to use a caster, the best options are going to be Babbage and Medea. Medea can spam her Noble Phantasm like very few others in the entire game, regardless of rarity. It hits about as hard as, surprise pillow attack, but even still, she can use it consistently. Her whole kit is kind of built around sustain and spamming her NP. Babbage just actually has a fairly decent skill set in terms of he's got a couple of different buffs. He's got a one-turn invincibility on his middle skill here, increase NP gain, gathers crit stars, strong skill. His Noble Phantasm is Buster and AoE, and it decreases the defense of enemies, and then his deck is like the Saber deck that has 2 Buster cards. So if you need an AoE option, I would go with Babbage. If you need a more single target option, I would go with Medea. Any which way, they're not going to be spectacular at DPS, just because casters in general are not, unless you're Caster Nero. But we're discussing lower rarity units. So moving on to assassins. Here's one where I have to pull a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. So the best 3-star assassin is almost certainly 100 Personas. Has 3, this one not so much, but the other skills are actually pretty interesting, especially for fairly early game lower rarity unit. Her Noble Phantasm deals a bunch of damage, buffs her Noble Phantasm with her middle skill. Just a fairly strong unit, and I would recommend using her the most out of any 3-star assassin. That said, I don't have her built. The other ones are largely not worth using. So Cursed Arm here is actually quite a strong crit star generator. Actually has the assassin deck, unlike 100 Personas. Has skills geared towards star generation. And then has high hit counts and good star generation stats on his cards as well. So if you need crit stars, he's basically the way to go. If you're looking more for AoE crit star generation, definitely go with Fuma. Has similar really strong star generation capability on his normal cards and his deck, and then his Noble Phantasm also hits all enemies. Is quick type, which means that it generates a bunch of stars as well. So probably go with Fuma if you need a AoE assassin, and go with 100 Personas if you need a single target assassin. I would say that for most players, Serenity, Jekyll, Jinkei, Sanson, Kojiro, these units are not terribly high impact and are not going to be very strong after a very early point in the game. So, moving on to Berserkers, this is another pretty easy one where the answer is Lubu. Basically, and I could be wrong here, Lubu is like sitting at the very, very, very top of the list across the entire game, regardless of rarity, for like single turn burst damage. Because you have him at NP5, he has 2 buffs to his Noble Phantasm. His Noble Phantasm is upgraded, single target buster that ignores defense. Oh, it's not upgraded actually. Well, do I look silly? So NP5, defense ignoring, single target, multiple buffs, and he can pull crit stars to himself. And with his deck, which is the bottom here, he can Buster Brave Chain, which adds significantly to his damage, especially if he can pull off those crits following the NP. So overall, Lubu has one of, if not the very highest, single turn bursts out of any character in the game when ignoring trait damage and special factors and that kind of thing. So Lubu is a tremendous, swap him in with Craft Essence that gives him a bunch of NP charge. If you've got a imaginary element or a K-scope or even just a 50% charge CE to just swap him in, do what you can to charge him up as quick as possible, and then just let him unload, and basically if you have a boss on the other end, they won't be there by the time he's done. So for the early game, definitely Lubu. By far best 3-star Berserker. Berserkers in general, and the specific niche of the one-turn burst servant, fall off really hard after the end of part 1. But up until then, Lubu will serve you very well. So that's basically it. Yeah, there's only 2 of these that are low rarity, and Salieri is story locked, and nobody has Angra Mainyu, so yeah. Anyways, those are basically my recommendations in each class for who I think will be the highest impact servants for most new players as they're getting into the game. Once you've got a decent option in every class, then you can start working on other projects, right? Like, I mentioned, for example, that Boudica is not going to be a high-impact servant for most people. Like, her skill set is really weird and not especially useful. Her NP is fine, I guess, but it's kind of like, what's the point when MASH exists, right? So, for most people, there's not really a reason to level Boudica unless you're just like, I just need a rider, in which case, use Ushi. But once you have Ushi, then you can start to say, well, I really like Boudica, so I'm going to level her. So once you have a strong option in every class, then you can start branching out into, you know, things that aren't going to be as necessary for you to do. But it's a really good idea to set up one strong character per class for you, so that you can have, you know, just a solid, like, mash, decent 3-star that you've raised yourself, and then like a support character of the same class that you just pull from your friends list. And that setup, just those 3, will basically get you through all of part 1 with fairly little difficulty until close to the end. So, anyways, that's what I have to say about this. Have any questions, want to know anything, let me know in the comments. If it's worth a video, I'll make a video about it. If not, I'll just answer you in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something.